at an angle, so I think I'm going to have to cut out a swath that's at an angle on this one. So I think that'll be kind of interesting because it won't just run kind of vertically through the bowl. The other thing, Carter and Sons Toolworks up in Seattle sent me some tools to play with, so I'm going to be doing this bowl with these to see how they work. So let's get going. So I think this is the original faceplate because the holes mostly line up. And I think these are these same screws I use too. So. The first thing to do is to mount the bowl back on the lathe and clean up the rim. With a flat rim, I can then start working on the bowl, like cutting out the crack on the bandsaw. So I'll put the bowl back on the lathe and get the tool rest lined up, and then clean up the rim. So this went pretty fast. And take the bowl off, and take the faceplate off. Then I can angle the table to cut out the crack at an angle. And I'm using my sled that I made that holds the bowl in place while I cut the bowl in half. What was tricky here is that the sled rides along the table of the bandsaw, so I had to hold the sled up and in the blade as it went through the blade. But it worked pretty well, and the cuts came out really nice and straight. You can see here how the pieces fit together. So what I need to do now is to rebuild the centerpiece. And the thought that I had during the last bowl that I made was to do a chevron, but I wanted to do something with a little more detail to it. That would be a little bit more complicated. So the thought I had was to build the sides of what would be the chevron out of segmented pieces as well, so you'd sort of get crooked stripes running up through the pattern. And it began to look plant-like, almost like a vine or a root, which I liked. I thought about angling the side pieces to the pattern as well, but in the end, the pieces were so small and making those angles was going to be very difficult. But maybe at some time in the future. So I found a nice piece of birch that's been sitting in the shop. It's from a tree that we took out of our yard. It's been drying for a few years now. And it's a little too warped to cut on the table saw, so I cut off a section on the bandsaw. And then jointed that piece, and then cut that piece down on the table saw once it was flat enough to run safely in the table saw. So this piece would be sort of the ground in the pattern. And I picked something light that would be similar to the maple, and I cut it into strips. Then I wanted a dark piece to make the dark parts of the pattern. So I found a piece of walnut. I seem to have a lot of little pieces of walnut in the shop, but this one was big enough to use. So I cut it into strips of about 1/8 of an inch thickness. So you can see how the birch and the walnut strips can go together to make the two sides of the pattern. And I glued that up. And I glued those together so it was sort of one big piece in the clamps. But the very center joint didn't have any glue in it, so that it would come apart as two pieces in the end. Then the two inside faces on this had to be made perfectly smooth, so I jointed those as they would get glued to a center piece of walnut, which would make the chevron pattern. So I cut a piece of walnut at the width of the two glued up pieces that I had just made. And I cut a 1/4 inch piece, approximately, to fit between the two segmented pieces. And then glued that all together. I had to use a little shim under one of the pieces to hold it up so that the pattern would be offset, which you can see here. The next step was to cut out roughly a square from this pattern that would be at an angle to the pattern itself. I tilted the table saw blade for the first cut, and then for the other 3 cuts I could make the table saw blade vertical again and then just run the piece through. Then I jointed that piece and got it to its final size on the joiner. Now that I had the segmented piece done, I could then start to rebuild that piece into the piece that I had cut out from the bowl. So I cut some pieces to glue back together again into that U shape. And you can start to see how the pattern's going to go together now. So I glued the first layer by itself, and that was straightforward. And then for the other layers, I just glued them all at once with a piece of scrap wood across the top of the piece to give me something to clamp to. Now the other thing I wanted to do, I thought it would be nice if there was a dark ring around the rim of the bowl, which would let the dark pattern within the segmented piece die into something as it got up to the rim of the bowl. So I made a single ring of walnut pieces to go at the rim of the bowl. Then I needed to glue the bowl back together again, so I sanded the faces that would get glue, and then glued the 3 pieces back together again. This was the most challenging piece to clamp, as there just wasn't a good way to clamp this. So I sort of balanced a clamp across the rim and then 2 clamps on the end, and it's sort of half clamping pressure, half just gravity holding that wedge in place. But it worked. And the rim needs to go on, so it's back to the disc sander. And the 2 nubbins on the segmented piece I decided could just be sanded off. That'd probably be the easiest and safest way to do that than trying to do that on the bandsaw. And I sanded the ring for the rim, and then glued those 2 pieces together. And this turned out to be really easy to clamp because it's just the 2 pieces. And I discovered that you can't clamp a seesaw. So I made a little piece that was the height of the bowl to clamp at one end, and then I could use that lever just to clamp the piece in place. I had a big piece that was sticking out on the bottom, so I used the bandsaw to just trim that off. And I trimmed the rim on the bandsaw, which I thought was just going to make it easier to turn because there'd be less material to turn, but it turned out that was actually a really good move because it allowed the big jaws to hold the rim a lot easier because it was round. And then I mounted that back on the lathe. Then the first thing to do was to make a mortise for the chuck to go in. I decided it'd be better to make a hole in the bottom for the chuck instead of a positive piece for the chuck to hold on to. And the rim of the bowl is round and centered, but the bottom was a little bit off. It's fine. I had plenty of material to work with. So I'm making the mortise for the chuck right now. Carter & Sons sent some different tools to use, and I tried the little detail tool to get into the corner of the mortise, but I wasn't really removing enough material, so I used the little spindle gouge, which actually worked really well. And I drilled out the center, and then put the chuck on. I have finally gotten a second chuck, which makes life a lot easier. And I'll put the bowl back on again. And I put the tailstock in, and I'm not sure that this is really doing a whole lot, but it helps hold the bowl in place a little better. I started with the outside to get that round. That went straightforward. Then I started on the inside, and I got the rim trimmed down. One of the things I'm finding that I really like with these tools is that with the weight of the handle and the stiffness of the handle, they're very accurate and they're very steady. So I found on the inside where I had a bunch of big bumps I had to turn off. When I was turning those, or sort of turning air, as they say, the tool was just sort of rock solid and didn't bounce around and let me do that turning. And some slow motion here to see what the pieces look like. They're very clean curls coming off the lathe. And I'm getting the inside cleaned up. I'm back to the outside. Another thing that I really like about these tools, because they're so steady, I could turn a very thin edge to the bowl. So I ended up going thinner than I usually do on the bowl, which was kind of nice. It was just so fun to turn this. I did use my scraper to put a final surface on the bowl, and then I sanded, did a bunch of sanding. What's nice about using the drill and the lathe at the same time is you get 2 circular motion, so that the sandpaper doesn't dig in too much in any one place. Then I turned the bowl around and worked on the bottom. I used the small spindle gouge to take the very center piece off and make the bottom nice and smooth. And I sanded the bottom and took the bowl off the lathe. Now it's time for finish, and I'm using my tried and true linseed oil finish. I realize at this point I want to do a different finish or make my own finish, but I'm sort of rushing to get the project done, so I just use what I have. So I need to figure out a finish when I'm not finishing the project, if that makes sense. And there it is. It came out really nice. I'd really like to thank Carter & Son Toolworks for sending me a set of their beautiful turning tools. These are definitely going to be my base set of turning tools. 2 summers ago I cut up a big Sequoia log with my friend Brian. Thanks
we got
for watching.
many big slabs out of it, but we also got some ends and some funny shaped bits that weren't really good for slabs. So I took some of these and I made one of them into a bowl blank, thinking I would turn it on the lathe. As I'm cutting this, I used a circle cut out of foam core to follow to make the circle for the bowl shape. This was before I had my circle cutting jig made on the bandsaw, and it's just screwed to the piece of wood. But it worked pretty well. It made a circle, which is just what I needed. After looking at this, I thought I really should cut it closer to a bowl shape, because I would have a ton of material to remove on the lathe if I turned it the way it is here. I made a jig for cutting circles at this point, so it's just a screw attached to a board. I can drill a hole in the flat side of the piece of wood and then set that in the screw on the piece of plywood, and then rotate the piece of wood around that screw and it'll cut a circle. Now with the table angled at 45 degrees, I get a cone shape, which is closer to the shape of the bowl that I want. So I rough turned it at this point. I attached a faceplate to the flat side of the wood, and that allowed me to work on the bottom and to make a tenon for the chuck. And once that tenon is made, I could turn the piece around and hollow out the bowl, which is what I'm doing here. I wouldn't recommend using gloves when turning. I did this before I knew better. Then I let this sit for about a year and dry, and I started to finish it up at this point, but I was having a terrible time getting the surface smooth with the regular lathe tools. And I realized I was going to need a really large chuck to hold the bowl backwards so that I could work on the bottom. I remember carving out the shape for the bowl was difficult because there was a knot right in the center, which is where the wood is turning the slowest, so it made it slow going. So I let it sit for another year after this, thinking about how I was going to get the surface smooth and how I was going to hold the bowl backwards with the bottom facing out. I decided what I needed to do was to make big jaws for my chuck that would be big enough to hold the rim of the bowl. So I cut out a circle out of a scrap piece of MDF that I had. So I think the circle diameter here is 22 inches, which will just fit on the lathe, and should be just big enough to hold the bowl. I'm using the same circle cutting jig that I made for the bowl when I first worked on it. Now the chuck is a 4-jaw chuck, so I need to cut the circle into 4 quarters. I decided that I should number them so I could keep track of them. They went back together again. I used my existing jaw chucks to find the holes that I would need to drill for the screws to mount these new plates to the chuck. Then it was just a matter of drilling those holes. I did need to be careful to make sure that they were in just the right places, but they did work in the end. I had to drill the countersink for the screws as well, and the bigger drill bit managed to center itself in the smaller holes. So that worked out well too. Then I mounted the new plates to the chuck, and the bowl seemed to fit, which was good. I thought I was going to have to balance the new jaws, but they actually felt pretty balanced on the lathe. So I just trued up the outer edge, which was dusty, but it worked really well. The last thing I wanted to do was make a series of cleats to go around the outer edge of the new jaw plates. I wanted them cut at the same angle as the bowl so that they would get a nice grip on the bowl. And I drilled holes and then cut that strip into cleats. Then I attached each of those cleats to the jaw plates with a screw. So now when I tighten up the chuck, those cleats will all hold the bowl in place. With this I could clean up the bottom, but mostly what I wanted to do at this point was to make the tenon round again so that it would fit back in the chuck. You can see now that I'm not wearing gloves, which is much safer. I clean up the tenon. It's good to be really precise about this so that it holds well in the chuck. So I take the chuck off and remount the bowl in the smaller jaws. Now, I can finalize the inside. I removed some more material with my bowl gouge. I used my scraper to try and get the surface as smooth as I could before I started sanding. Now to work on the surface, I thought I would try my angle grinder because it would be a little bit more aggressive. And the little one worked, but I thought maybe I'd try my big angle grinder. So I got that out with a sanding disc on it. And if I went along real carefully, it actually worked pretty well. It was really quick, but it also gave me a good surface. So the surface was rough with sanding marks, but at least the fuzziness from the tools wasn't there. I sanded the outside of the bowl. Then I went through the different sanding grits with my drill sander. This is a lot slower, but I don't really have to take off that much material. I just have to get the surface smooth. Now I turn the bowl around again so that I can turn the tenon on the bottom into a foot for the bowl. I can work on the very bottom surface of the bowl as well, and work on the foot, and sand the very bottom of the form of the bowl. There's a void at the bottom of the bowl that made it a little bit tricky, but it was okay. And now the bowl is done. And I'll clean up the surface with mineral spirits to get the dust off. And then some linseed oil beeswax finish. And it's done. There's a few little defects here and there, but there's some spots in the grain of the wood that are really beautiful. But it turned out pretty nice for a 2-year-long project.